Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Hayes Collins, and today I want to talk with you about social justice issue that I don't just study; I live it every day in my classroom. The issue is inclusive and special education in early childhood settings. So, why does this matter? Why am I standing in front of you talking about it? An inclusive education is a social justice issue because it determines whether children from diverse backgrounds, children who are developing on a different timeline than their peers, and children with disabilities actually get a fair shot at thriving in school. This isn't a niche topic, it touches nearly every classroom in the country. And right now, the progress we've made toward truly inclusive classrooms is at risk from policies that could undo years of hard work growth. My goal today is simple. I want you to understand why this issue matters, show what the research says, connect it to our professional responsibilities as educators and leaders, and share where I personally stand as I move forward in this work. By the end of our time together, I hope you'll walk away not just informed, but ready to act as a stakeholder in this effort. Let's start by grounding ourselves in what we actually mean by social justice and inclusive education, because these are big terms and get used a lot without much explanation. Social justice in inclusive education can apply to economic status, cultural background, language, and developmental differences. For a long time, these ideas have been talked about by politicians and administrators, but talk hasn't always translated into practice. Historically, students with learning differences were placed into what were essentially holding rooms, separated spaces where they didn't receive instruction or support they actually needed, as Thomas and Locksley described in their 2022 research. It took years of research and advocacy to even recognize that these students were being pushed aside rather than taught. And here's the part that really struck me when I was researching this. The other children in the classroom notice. Highland's 2010 research found that when young children are included in classrooms alongside peers with different abilities and are taught about social justice from an early age, they begin to internalize that value themselves. They want to step up and help classmates they see being treated unfairly. In other words, inclusive classrooms don't just help students who need extra help, they shape how an entire generation of children learns to treat one another. That's a powerful argument for why this work matters. It's why I believe so strongly in fostering equity and cultural relevant teaching starting in early childhood, not later. Now, why should we defend this as a priority rather than treating it as optional? Look at the history. Schools have gradually shifted toward valuing test scores above students who are actually sitting in classrooms. Thomas's 2022 research describes how students who struggle academically are often pushed out of schools because the effect they have on the school's test scores, a pattern researchers call marketization of education. The marketization increases what Thomas and Locksley call marginalization, exclusion, and what's sometimes referred to as off-rolling, essentially removing students who make a school look worse on paper. When schools chase test scores instead of student growth, the children most likely to be left behind are dual language learners, students from marginalized communities, and students who simply aren't developmentally aligned with the rigid state curriculum. Rose's 2024 research adds another layer to this. Policy frequently requires teachers to follow strict, standardized curriculum in the name of accountability that leaves very little room for differentiation. Teachers end up functioning, in Rose's words, as technicians who implement predetermined lessons rather than professionals who respond in actual child to the actual child in front of them. That's a direct contradiction. We say we want inclusive classrooms, but policies in place often lock teachers into one size fits all systems. This is exactly why equity and cultural relevant teaching have to be defended, not assumed. Without intentional effort, the system defaults to leaving children behind. But this is where it's important. There's real documented progress. Maynell 2024 research found that students with disabilities are gaining meaningful skills in inclusive classrooms. And just as important, their peers without disabilities are thriving too. There isn't a zero-sum trade-off. The research consistently shows when schools focus on students instead of test scores, everyone benefits. Let me bring this down to earth with an example from my own professional life because I think this is where the research becomes real. I teach transitional kindergarten, or TK, an extra year of school designed for children who might be too young, not yet developmentally ready, or who are dual language learners, giving them more time to develop before entering kindergarten. California implemented TK statewide back in 2010, after seeing a significant rise in the number of dual language learners entering the school system. Lloyd and colleagues found in their 2020 study that these dual language learners on average underperformed their English-only classmates. And without intervention, many of these children, often first-generation Americans or children of immigrants, get placed in a system that measures them almost entirely by test scores and lets them fall further behind. That's what creates what research calls the achievement gap, a gap that widens whenever students with economic, cultural, or developmental differences don't get the support they need to catch up. In a 2015 study, Yang Zhang found that this gap had actually widened over the last 40 years, when she also found something hopeful: high quality, inclusive education that has been shown to close that gap. When we look back at the California TK studies, the researchers wanted to know whether one extra year of high quality instruction could raise outcomes for dual language learners across every subject. What they found was that high quality teachers combined with strong alignment to teachers' curriculum that follows led to significantly higher language proficiencies for these students, according to Haloy's 2020 findings. So here's my contextual takeaway for you. If your organization is serious about closing achievement gaps, the answer isn't more testing. It's investing in qualifying, well-trained teachers and giving them time and alignment they need to actually reach every learner. That's something any of us in any organization working with young children can advocate starting tomorrow. Now let's connect this to us, to our professional responsibilities as educators and leaders. Because policy alone doesn't change classrooms, people do. Policymakers and administrators can write inclusive education into law, but if teachers aren't properly trained, none of it gets implemented with fidelity. Amera's 2025 research, based on a study conducted in Ethiopia during the rollout of a new inclusive education program, makes this point clearly. Teachers, Amera argues, need to design flexible and accessible learning environments and apply strategies that accommodate every learner in the room. That's not a passive skill. It requires ongoing professional development, innovative leadership, and a willingness to keep learning throughout a career, which is really what we mean when we talk about 21st century learning as professionals, not just as students. Amera goes further and argues that teacher preparation is the single biggest factor in whether inclusive education succeeds or fails. Teachers need practical, hands-on training in working with diverse learners, not just theory. And the barriers are real. Large class sizes, limited instruction support, and societal attitudes that haven't caught up to the research that all get in the way. This tells us something important about professionalism in our field. Being a professional in early childhood education today means more than following a curriculum. It means being a leader in your own building, advocating for training, questioning policies that harm students in your care, and holding yourself accountable to what the research actually shows works, not just what's administratively convenient. That kind of leadership is being tested now. Kaufman and Hornsby 2025 research points to a growing extremist movement that pushes for what's called full inclusion, placing every student who needs specialized support directly into general education population, regardless of what that setting can actually meet their needs. This movement, Kaufman argues, ignores the decades of research showing the real value of individualized inclusive support. And it's often driven by people disconnected from the day-to-day reality of actual classrooms, actual administrators, and actual teachers. If we layer that on top of teachers who are actually stretched thin with responsibilities, adding students into classrooms without training or support to serve them isn't inclusion. It's a setup for failure for students, for teachers alike. That's exactly why innovative leadership matters here. It's on us as professionals to push back on policy driven by ideology rather than evidence, and to keep advocating for that kind of well-resourced, well-trained inclusion that actually works. I want to close by sharing where I personally stand because I believe advocacy has to start with a clear personal commitment. As an early childhood educator, I believe every child deserves a classroom where their culture, their language, their developmental pace, and their abilities are treated as strengths to build on, not obstacles to work around. I'm committed to designing flexible and accessible learning environments, to advocating for training and resources that make real inclusion possible, rather than inclusion in name only. Not to measure and to measuring my training and resources success as a teacher by whether every child in my room is growing, not by a single test score. I commit to being a voice for the children and families who are too often left out of the policy conversations that affect them most, into continuing my own professional learning so that my classroom reflects the research we know works, not just the mandates that are easiest to follow. So, where does that leave us? The risks facing social justice and inclusive education are real and ongoing. Gaps in teacher training, ever growing responsibilities placed on educators, and policy movements that threaten to unravel progress that's already been proven to work. The story isn't only about risk. Inclusive education is making real, measurable differences for children who need it. Programs like Transitional Kindergarten are helping dual language learners thrive and are closing achievement gaps that have persisted for decades. None of that happens, though, without properly trained teachers and leaders who are willing to advocate for what research supports. That's where you come in, whether you're an administrator, a fellow teacher, a policymaker, or a community member. You have a role to play as a stakeholder in this work. I'd ask you to leave here today thinking about one concrete step you can make, whether that's advocating for teacher training funding, supporting inclusive programs in your own organization, or simply learning more about research we've discussed today. Thank you so much for your time and attention.